I think I'm going to start with peace be with you. Good morning, selamat pagi. Selamat pagi. I've been tasked to have a chat with you about John 6, verse 51 to 58. Jesus said, "I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me and I in them." Now, English is not my first language. Indonesian is. But did we just heard that the gospel reading suggesting Jesus is talking about eating his flesh and drinking his blood? What's going on here? What in the world is he talking about? And why is he associating eating his flesh and blood and drinking his blood with some sort of a dwelling and location or abiding of him in us and us in him? Why is that? One of the things that Jesus is doing here is focusing on a spiritual truth, a spiritual plane, a spiritual reality. But he is talking about it in a physical term. And when he does the sort of things like this, normally he loses us. It's challenging to understand because we think more physically rather than spiritually. So in this particular text, he is trying to get us to reflect not just on the physical reality, but on a spiritual reality. And the Gospel of John is full of story of people getting confused about these two important realities, the physical reality and the spiritual reality. It's not surprise if you read the previous chapters in John 3, you'll see Nicodemus encountering Jesus, talking about being born again. Nicodemus is talking about physical reality. Jesus is talking about spiritual reality. The conversation don't meet. Then after that reading, you'll hear more stories of Jesus and the woman in the well. Asking for water, the woman is talking about, you don't even have a bucket. You don't even have a cup. And Jesus is talking about a spiritual truth about living waters. Woof, that goes off again. And now we're seeing Jesus again talking about the bread of life. Those who eat my flesh and drink his blood will abide in him and him in us. So how do we make sense of these things? I like the reading of Proverbs today, Proverbs 9. Proverbs 9 encourages us to use the gift of wisdom to build our house, our pillars, our table, and our insight. To use wisdom to make sense of the things that is without sense and walk in the way of insight. So what is that wisdom? For me, it's spirituality. And what does spirituality mean? Well, there's no one definition. But in general, spirituality is something everyone can experience. Helps us to find meaning and purpose in the things we value. It can bring hope, healing in times of suffering and loss, and it encourages us to seek the best relationships with ourselves, with others, and what lies beyond. And these spirituality experiences are not airy-fairy, but are part of being a human being. Because from it views life as a journey, where good and bad experiences can help you to learn, develop, and mature. It's kind of different from a religious experience. Because the religious is about matter of choices regarding beliefs, code of conducts, rights, and shared cultural traditions. But spirituality stands for lifestyles and practices that embody a vision of human existence and of how the human spirit is to achieve its full potential. So in that sense, spirituality embraces an aspiration approach because it involves freedom and liberation. In fact, our church says, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Because it involves freedom and liberation. And makes no assumptions about the person's conviction or life orientation. It focuses on whatever belief that gives their life purpose. So now I'm using my spiritual lens. And I can more or less understand what Jesus is saying when he said, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide or belong in me and I in them. Two things I want to share this morning with you. One is about the bread of life, and the other is about the abiding, about the belonging. Firstly, why bread? You see, we live as hungry people in a hungry world. Various of bread being eaten in our lives and in the community today. Just recently, I think Margaret, in her street at home, there is violence and murder. Is that right? In Forest Lodge? Bread of violence and murder. There's bread of negativity and hostility. This week, there's bread of discrimination and racism. All sorts of bread being offered in this community. Bread that depersonalizes another human being. Bread of hurt feelings, of fear, of loneliness, of sorrow or guilt. We are offered to eat all these kinds of bread. But not all breads sustain and grows life. Not all bread is good. That's what Jesus is talking about in today's gospel, that when we take him into our lives, eat his bread of life, that means we live conforming to the life of Christ. The way of Christ. And that which is of Christ involves love. Love is the key. Matthew 5, verses 43 to 45, I won't read it now, but reminds us of that. This way of love is the way of Jesus and is the bread of life. Today is an invitation to live like it, to live out your God-created identity, living generously and graciously towards others, the way God lives towards you. And so if it's not about love, then it's not about Christ. And you cannot speak of love on its own. It doesn't exist alone. Because if we want to fully experience love, we also must speak about belonging. This is why Jesus is talking about, eat my flesh and drink my blood, and I will abide in him, and him in us. The Royal Society of Arts in the United Kingdom in 2014 produced a statement that I think worth reflecting on. That love is the promise of belonging. Love is the promise of belonging. I like it. Brene Brown, a professor of social work at the University of Houston, in her research interviewing people about their understanding of shame and vulnerability, she found that in people's story they never speak of love without speaking of belonging. It always comes together. It's not an accidental entanglement, it's an intentional knot, because love belongs to belonging. And Brené Brown, after collecting thousands and thousands of people's stories, concluded that there's a deep sense of love in belonging, and love and belonging is an irreducible need for all of us, women, men, and children. Because love belongs with belonging is about worthiness, a person's worthiness. For us, the people of faith, you and I are worthy because you and I are loved and made in the image of good God. We all belong to God and not owned by anyone. And if you belong to God, you can be who you are, authentic, with your shortcomings and imperfections, but you also are treasured. And this is a very different thing to fitting in. In fact, fitting in is one of the greatest barriers to belonging. Fitting in is about assessing a situation and becoming who you need to be in order to be accepted. Fitting in is being accepted for being like everybody else. I have to be like you to fit in. Belonging, on the other hand, is different. Doesn't require us to change who we are. It requires us to be who we are. Belonging is being accepted for you. I get to be me if I belong. So belonging is an innate human desire to be part of something larger than us. And sometimes, sadly, we often try to acquire it by fitting in and seeking approvals. Because to be honest, it is much easier, isn't it, to say, I'll be whoever or whatever you need me to be as long as I feel like I'm part of this. But it doesn't. We can only belong when we offer our most authentic selves and when we are embraced for who we are. I am convinced that belonging is in our DNA. We are biologically, cognitively, physically, and spiritually wired to love, to be loved, and to belong. And when love and belonging are absent, we don't function as we were meant to. We break, we fall apart, we numb, we ache, we hurt others, we get sick, leading to suffering. So it's not enough just to say love, but to understand that love belongs to belonging. Some of our leaders in this country are suffering from a lack of understanding of love and belonging. Just this week, we saw in the media that we still have leaders in 2018 in this country who calls for a return to the white Australian policy system. This is what I call a lack of love and belonging. A lack of practicing love and a lack of understanding of what belonging means. I'm wearing my batik today. I didn't wear my long robe, ministerial, whatever. Because being an Australian Indonesian, I am offended of last Wednesday by Senator Anning and Bob Cater's racist remark. I am offended. I am offended not because I'm a lefty or categorized as a lefty. I am offended because I know what it's like being the receiving end of racism, and it is nasty. I grew with that in my primary school, I grew with that in high school, I grew with that all through my life. I know what it's like because I know that it loses that love and belonging for me. Racist remarks always make me feel that I don't belong, and that I'm not loved, and that I'm kind of disconnected If that makes sense. It really hurts because it does strips my humanity and my identity away from me. But I choose not to eat this bread of racism. I choose not to eat this bread that dehumanizes a person. Instead, I will remember what the gospel reading said today. Jesus, the way of love, the bread of life. If we eat this bread, he will abide in me and I in him. I will eat this food that Jesus offers, which I know will continue to sustain me, to challenge ideology that sought to divide and perishes us. Because I believe when we take Jesus into our lives, it's a serious matter, and we all live differently. We make a commitment that we live differently, and we reject those things that dehumanize a person. When we take Jesus into our life, we see ourselves and one another as persons created in the image and likeness of God, rather than an obstacle or an issue to be overcome. I really see this love and belonging as a mission of God. I see that this is our calling to participate in that mission of God. You and I are called to participate, to spread out this message of love and belonging. To become like Jesus, food for our community that will sustain, grow and develop and gives life. To become like Jesus, the bread of life, working for justice and peace to all that God has made. And again, become food for our community, to offer love and belonging. Amen.